The exhaustion was deep in my bones. It was a heavy, satisfying sort of tiredness, the kind that comes from spending 10 solid hours managing a small army of children. I'm a community worker, which means my day-to-day life is a whirlwind of organizing events and strangling chaos. But Halloween is always a different beast. Right? This particular Halloween, 2 years ago, in 2023, our center threw a massive festival. We had competitive games, costume contests, and the absolute highlight, a ruthless, no-holds-barred kids versus parents dodgeball match. It was incredible. It was loud, and it was incredibly draining. I was 22 at the time, and by 6 o'clock that evening, all I wanted was my couch, complete silence, and maybe a cold beer. I had been home for exactly 1 hour when my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was my little sister, Savannah. She was 15, going on 30, and she was calling with a massive favor. Neither my parents nor my older brother, the parents of my 11-year-old nephew, Jackson, had the energy to take the kids trick or treating. So, as per the unspoken laws of family dynamics, the duty tumbled down the ladder until it landed squarely on my shoulders. I had to be the cool big brother. I wasn't feeling it. I was physically spent. But I groaned, hauled myself off the couch, threw out a fresh hoodie, and drove over to my parents' house to collect them. When I walked in, Jackson was practically vibrating with excitement, fully decked out in a blue and black ninja suit, Sub-Zero from Mortal Kombat. Savannah was in the bathroom, painstakingly applying white face paint to nail her costume as Raven from Teen Titans. White. Once the ghostly makeup was perfected, we piled into my car. I wanted this to be efficient. I drove them to a massive, affluent neighborhood a few miles away. It was the kind of area known for handing out full-sized candy bars, meaning we could hit a few blocks, fill the pillowcases, and be done. For the first hour, everything was picture perfect. The crisp October air smelled like dead leaves and wood smoke. Families were strolling down the sidewalks, flashlights bobbing in the dark. We even hit one house where an older gentleman wasn't handing out candy at all. He had a massive grill fired up in his driveway, handing out freshly grilled hot dogs to the kids. Protein, he told me with a wink. Better for the body than all that sugar. Honestly, it was brilliant. By the time we hit the final cul-de-sac, it was getting late. The younger kids had already been shepherded home, and the neighborhood was growing noticeably quiet. The lively hum of the evening had faded into a low, echoing silence. We had parked pretty far down the main drag, which meant we had a solid 10-minute walk back to my car. As we turned to head back, my eyes swept the street. I've always been highly observant. It's a byproduct of growing up in a city where you have to keep your head on a swivel. And that night my hypervigilance kicked in hard. Across the street, standing perfectly still in the middle of a dark, manicured lawn, was a figured lawn. There were no porch lights on behind them. The house was pitch black. I'm genuinely surprised I even spotted them at all. I squinted through the gloom. The person was dressed head to toe in absolute black. Like, they wore a long, heavy hooded cloak that draped down to their ankles, completely obscuring their shape. But what made my stomach drop was their face. There wasn't one. They were wearing a featureless black mask beneath the hood. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, young or old. But even without visible eyes, I could feel the distinct, heavy pressure of their stare. They were looking directly at us. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice incredibly low and calm. I put a hand on Savannah's shoulder and pulled Jackson closer to my leg. "Stay tight to me." Savannah looked up, instantly sensing the shift in my tone. "There's someone standing in that yard across the street," I murmured, staring straight ahead as we walked. Look, but do not stare." I wanted them to be aware of the potential threat without doing anything to provoke it. Jackson, being an innocent 11-year-old, totally botched it. He spun his head around, pointed right at the figure, and laughed. Wait. Whoa, that's creepy. Someone's trying to scare people. Savannah didn't laugh. She looked across the street, saw the featureless black mask staring back, and her face went rigid. Now, here is a crucial piece of context. Inside the black backpack slung over my shoulder, nestled against my wallet and keys, was my licensed Glock 19. Savannah knew I carried. Jackson did not. So when Savannah looked at me and saw the hard line of my jaw, she knew instantly that this wasn't a game. We picked up our pace, our sneakers slapping against the pavement. I kept my eyes locked on the street ahead, resisting the urge to look over my shoulder. We had made it about a block down when the silence of the neighborhood was shattered. Thud, thud, thud. Heavy, aggressive footsteps were echoing on the concrete behind us. It wasn't the soft patter of sneakers. It was the distinct, rhythmic crunch of heavy boots. I stopped. I turned around. The figure had crossed the street, and they were closing the distance. But now, they had dropped the heavy cloak. The fabric was gone, revealing what was underneath, and the sight of it made the blood freeze in my veins. The person was wearing a full-on tactical vest. Thick black tactical pants were tucked tightly into heavy combat boots. The featureless face wasn't a cheap Halloween mask. It was a tight, black spandex balaclava pulled down over their neck. When you see someone stalking you in the dark wearing tactical gear, your brain instantly jumps to one terrifying conclusion: they are armed. My hand moved instinctively toward the zipper of my backpack pack. Listen to me, I hissed to the kids, my voice trembling with suppressed adrenaline. Do not stop walking. Do not look back. That person is following us. Keep your composure and keep moving. I locked eyes with Jackson, making sure he understood I wasn't playing a game. He looked pale. Savannah grabbed his hand, squeezing it tight. We walked. We didn't run. Running triggers a predator's instinct to chase. We power walked, our hearts hammering against our ribs. Shot quick, frantic glances over my shoulder. The figure maintained the exact same distance, 20 yards back, pacing us perfectly. My car finally came into view under a flickering street lamp, but the figure wasn't breaking off. That they were still coming. I made a split-second decision. We couldn't get to the car, unlock it, and get inside before they closed the gap. I had to take control of the situation. I stopped dead in my tracks, spun around, reached into my bag, and drew my Glock. I leveled the barrel directly at the approaching figure. My finger hovered just outside the trigger guard. But why the fuck are you following us? I yelled, my voice echoing off the silent houses. The figure stopped instantly. Their hands shot up into the air, palms open, an involuntary reaction of shock. Very slowly, moving with exaggerated caution, they reached up and peeled the black spandex mask off their head. It was a woman. She looked to be in her mid-30s, with messy hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. She kept her hands raised, but she didn't say a word. She just stared at me. Her expression was completely, unnerving and blank. I'm going to ask you one more time, I shouted, adjusting my grip on the weapon. Wait, why are you following us? When she finally spoke, her voice was monotone, completely devoid of emotion. I'm an undercover cop, she said flatly. I got a call about a break-in. I was standing outside that house to investigate. But when you looked at me funny, like, I assumed you were the perpetrators, so it would be wise to lower your weapon. Wait, or I will have you arrested for threatening an officer of the law. I stared at her over the sights of my gun. My brain spun wildly, trying to process her words. I slowly lowered the weapon, pointing it at the asphalt by her feet. What else was I supposed to do? If she actually was a cop, I didn't want to end the night in handcuffs. But her story was complete and utter garbage. If there was a break-in, Why was she standing perfectly still in the middle of a lawn, facing the street, nowhere near the house? Why was she wearing a massive, theatrical cloak over her gear? And what kind of logic dictates that a guy holding his little sister's hand while carrying pumpkin-shaped candy buckets is the prime suspect for a burglary, simply because he looked at her funny? The adrenaline began to mix with anger. "If you're an undercover cop," I asked, my voice rising, "why are you wearing a tactical vest? Doesn't that defeat the entire purpose of being undercover? And what was the deal with the cloak?" She didn't answer. She lowered her hands. And then, her blank expression vanished. It was replaced by a look of sheer malice. Her eyes narrowed, flashing with a dark, irritated fury that I had dared to question her lie. "Right." Then, she smiled. It was a slow, creeping, psychotic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "If you didn't have that gun," she whispered, her voice carrying easily across the 20 yards of asphalt, "this night would have ended a hell of a lot different for you." A cold shudder ran down my spine, and right as the words left her mouth, movement caught my eye in the peripheral darkness. Emerging silently from the narrow, pitch-black alleyways between the houses were more figures. 3 men, white, all dressed in the exact same black tactical gear, all wearing combat boots. They stepped onto the sidewalk and began walking purposefully toward us. "Get in the car," I barked at the kids, never taking my eyes off the woman. "Get in the car right now." I kept my body square toward the group, holding the gun down by my side but clearly visible. I listened to the terrified scrambling behind me as Savannah threw open the doors and shoved Jackson into the back seat. Once, I heard the door slam shut. I backed up slowly, climbed into the driver's seat, and slammed my door. I threw the car into drive and hit the gas. As we pulled away, I checked the rearview mirror. The woman was still standing exactly where I had left her in the middle of the street, watching my taillights, still smiling that horrific smile. The 4 figures who had joined her, however, were not smiling. They stood in a perfect line beside her, staring blankly after my car like a squad of soulless mannequins. The doctor home was suffocatingly silent. Nobody said a word. The kids were in shock, their candy completely forgotten. I dropped them off at my parents' house, watched them sprint through the front door, and then drove back to my apartment in a daze. I couldn't sleep. My mind was a chaotic mess. White. Why in a neighborhood packed with families and teenagers did they single us out? I desperately wished the nightmare had ended when I pulled out of that neighborhood, but it didn't. 3 days later, my phone buzzed on my kitchen counter. It was a text message from an unknown number. I opened it. There was no text, no threat, just a single photograph. It was a picture of my car, taken at night, parked in the assigned spot in my apartment complex. The blood drained from my face. I immediately called the police and gave them the entire story. The tactical gear, the fake cop, the group emerging from the shadows, and the photograph. They took my statement, but their response was infuriatingly predictable. Because there was no explicit threat in the text message, and because I had drawn my weapon first, there was nothing they could actively investigate. I hung up the phone, feeling completely violated and utterly alone. Driven by a mix of paranoia and morbid curiosity, I drove back to that affluent neighborhood in broad daylight. I parked my car, walked up to the house where I had first spotted the woman in the cloak, and knocked on the door. A normal-looking guy in his mid-40s answered. I politely asked him if he had experienced a break-in or any police activity at his home on Halloween night. He looked at me like I had 2 heads. "No," he said, frowning. "I went to bed at 9. I didn't hear a thing." I thanked him and walked back to my car. I already knew the undercover cop story was a fabrication, but hearing it confirmed chilled me to the bone. Whoever those people were, they weren't random thugs. They were organized. They moved silently. They worked as a unit. And somehow, they had managed to track my license plate, find my apartment, and get my cell phone number. White, was it a random encounter? Or had they been watching us from the moment we parked? Were they planning an abduction, a robbery, an assault? And did the simple fact that I was armed derail an entirely different, horrific outcome? Those questions haunted me for a very long time. I had to start going to therapy to deal with the sheer paranoia of walking to my car at night. I installed multiple security cameras around my apartment just to be able to sleep. It's been 2 years. The unknown number never texted again. The ghosts in the tactical gear vanished back into the shadows they came from. But the lesson remains burned into my mind. You never truly know who is watching you from the darkness. You never know when your existence alone makes you a target. Stay hyper-aware. Because I can say with absolute terrifying certainty, my Glock saved our lives that night. Sometimes, the terror doesn't stalk you down a quiet suburban street. Sometimes, it waits for you in the very places designed for childish joy. I was 12 years old, and Halloween was usually a predictable affair of pillowcases and neighborhood sidewalks. But this year, my parents decided to mix it up. They booked a weekend at a small, rustic family resort nestled about an hour deep into the Pennsylvania countryside. The resort was quaint. It consisted of a cluster of log cabins, a central lodge that smelled permanently of pine needles, and a large open field set up for autumn activities. But what truly defined the property were the woods. Dense, old-growth timber surrounded the resort on all 4 sides. During the sunlit hours, it looked like a postcard. But the moment the sun dipped below the tree line, those woods transformed into an impenetrable wall of black. We checked into our cabin early Saturday afternoon. The air was crisp, laced with the scent of woods, smoke, and hot cider. Children were already sprinting across the lawns in varying states of costume dress. The main attraction for the night was a massive haunted hayride, scheduled to begin right after sunset. I dropped my bags and sprinted out to the main lawn. They had set up classic carnival games, ring tosses, bobbing for apples, pumpkin painting. It was here that I bumped into a kid named Ryan. He was my age, decked out in a classic plastic skeleton suit, and was staying in the cabin right next door. We bonded immediately over the shared goal of accumulating as much sugar as humanly possible. As the sky bruised purple and finally faded to black, the air grew incredibly cold. Around 7 o'clock, the resort staff began herding families toward a massive wooden barn at the edge of the property. Parked outside was a massive green tractor, hitched to a long, low wooden wagon lined with hay bales. Ryan and I scrambled onto the back of the wagon, wedging ourselves between a group of giddy parents and terrified younger siblings. The driver, an older man wearing a remarkably unsettling scarecrow mask, fired up the diesel engine. With a heavy jolt, the tractor lurched forward, dragging us away from the safety of the lodge lights and straight into the pitch-black maw of the woods. The trail was illuminated only by sputtering tiki torches staked into the dirt every 50 yards. It was exactly what you would expect from a family-friendly haunt. As the tractor crawled along the rutted path, resort employees dressed in cheap zombie makeup and rubber werewolf masks would sporadically leap out from behind the tree trunks, roaring at the wagon. The kids would shriek, the parents would laugh, and the tractor would rumble on. It was good, harmless fun. But about halfway through the loop, the atmosphere shifted. We entered a stretch of the trail where the tiki torches were spaced much further apart, leaving long, suffocating stretches of absolute darkness. The tractor engine downshifted, crawling at a snail's pace. I was sitting on the edge of the wagon, my legs dangling over the side. I peered out into the gloom, trying to spot the next zombie hiding in the brush. Instead, I saw him. Standing just past the faint orange glow of a torch, right at the dense edge of the tree line, was a man. He wasn't an employee. He wasn't wearing zombie makeup or a monster mask. He was completely out of place. He wore a heavy, dark winter jacket, faded blue jeans, and a dark baseball cap pulled aggressively low over his forehead. He stood perfectly still, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. He wasn't lunging at the wagon. He wasn't making spooky noises. He was just standing in the freezing dark, watching us roll past. At first, my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe he's the manager making sure the employees are doing their jobs. But as the wagon drew closer, the hair on my arms stood up. I looked directly at him. His face was entirely swallowed by the shadow of his hat brim. But I felt it. I felt the heavy, suffocating weight of his eyes locked directly onto mine. I tore my gaze away and wildly looked at the adults sitting around me on the wagon. Nobody else was looking at him. Everyone was laughing at a werewolf on the opposite side of the trail. I snapped my head back. He was still there. Still perfectly still. Still staring right at me as the tractor slowly pulled me away into the darkness. I spent the remainder of the ride with my heart hammering in my throat, constantly checking the woods behind us. When the tractor finally broke through the tree line and parked back at the barn, I nearly leapt off the wagon. I scanned the edge of the woods, but he was gone. I didn't say a word to Ryan or my parents. I convinced myself I was just a jumpy kid letting the atmosphere get the better of me. We retreated to the safety of the main lodge area. My parents settled into Adirondack chairs around a massive, roaring bonfire, while Ryan and I resumed our quest for candy at the snack tables. An hour passed. The fear had mostly evaporated. Until I looked up from pouring myself a cup of cider. He was back. He was standing about 30 feet away, hovering at the very edge of the tree line, completely separated from the warm glow of the bonfire and the crowd of families. He was just standing there, alone, hands in his pockets, staring directly into the crowd. My stomach plummeted. The ambient light from the fire was a bit brighter here, and I managed to catch a glimpse of his face. I saw the rough stubble of a short beard. I saw a faint white logo stitched onto the front of his dark cap. I frantically elbowed Ryan in the ribs and pointed a trembling finger. Ryan squinted. Yeah. What? He's probably just one of the workers. He's not a worker, I hissed, panic rising in my chest. He was out deep in the woods during the hayride. Night. Not doing anything. Just watching. Ryan shrugged, entirely unbothered. So, Mike, maybe he's just some kid's dad taking a break. I desperately wanted to buy that logic. But dads don't stand completely alone in the dark, 30 feet away from their families, staring unblinking at a crowd of children. I looked back down at my cider, trying to calm my breathing. When I looked up 10 seconds later, the spot near the trees was empty. By 9 o'clock, the resort was rapidly quieting down. The toddlers had been carried off to bed, and the crowd around the bonfire had thinned out significantly. But Ryan and I worked well. Fueled by pure sugar and the thrill of independence, we decided we needed one final scare before the night ended. Behind the cluster of cabins, there was a narrow, unmarked dirt trail that snaked back into the woods. Ryan pointed to it, his eyes shining with a dare. Let's go down there. Just a little bit. Unless you're scared. I was terrified. But the social pressure of a 12-year-old boy is an immovable force. I clicked on my heavy plastic flashlight, nodded, and we walked past the cabins and onto the trail. The moment the trees closed in around us, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The comforting crackle of the bonfire was instantly swallowed by the dense timber. The only sound was the loud, rhythmic crunch of our sneakers on the dry dirt. We walked for maybe 200 feet, our flashlight beams bouncing erratically against the tree trunks. The trail opened up slightly into a small, dead-end clearing. Nailed aggressively to a massive oak tree was a rusted white sign, "Private Property," No trespassing. Wait. Ryan picked up a handful of pebbles and started chucking them at the side, making loud metallic clangs echo through the quiet woods. We were laughing, making terrible ghost noises, acting incredibly foolish. And then, the woods went dead silent. Because from deeper down the path, shrouded entirely in darkness, Blight, we heard footsteps. Crunch, crunch, crunch. They were heavy, methodical, slow. The distinct, weighted steps of a grown man walking directly toward us. Ryan froze, a rock still clutched in his hand. He looked at me, his eyes wide. Probably just another kid, he whispered, his voice trembling. But we both knew it wasn't a kid. I aimed my flashlight beam down the narrow path. The yellow light cut through the gloom, illuminating the dirt, the roots, the tree trunks. Wait, until the beam hit the edge of the darkness. The footsteps stopped. For 10 agonizing seconds, the silence was absolute. And then, a voice drifted out of the dark. Hey there, boys. It was a man's voice. It was incredibly calm, soft, almost soothing. But beneath the softness, there was a chilling, predatory vibration. Might. My heart slammed against my ribs. Ryan backed up slowly until his shoulder hit my arm. The man stepped forward, finally crossing into the very edge of my flashlight beam. It was him. But the faded jeans, the baseball cap pulled low. He didn't step fully into the light. He kept his face obscured in the shadows. What are you two doing all the way out here? He asked, his tone deceptively casual. He took a slow, deliberate step closer. You boys like candy? My throat was parched. I couldn't have spoken if I tried. He slowly pulled his right hand out of his jacket pocket. He held it up, pinching something between his thumb and forefinger. In the beam of my flashlight, the bright orange foil of a Reese's peanut butter cup glinted sharply. I've got a whole bunch more of these, he said, his voice dropping an octave. Back at my cabin. Come on, I'll give you some. Ryan took a terrified step backward. I could see the panic vibrating through his entire body. The man noticed the retreat. He took 2 fast, heavy steps toward us, closing the distance rapidly. You don't have to be scared, he said, the fake softness evaporating from his voice, replaced by a hard, demanding edge. It's Halloween. I'm just giving out candy. He paused, tilting his head slightly. I saw you boys on the hayride earlier. The bottom fell out of my stomach. He had been hunting us. I dropped the flashlight. I grabbed Ryan by the back of his shirt, hauled him around, and screamed the only word my brain could process. Right. Wait. We were back down the dirt path, completely blind in the dark, our sneakers slipping and sliding on the loose rocks. For one terrifying second, I heard the heavy, thundering pound, pound, pound of his boots hitting the dirt behind us. He was giving chase. I didn't look back. I ran harder than I had ever run in my entire life. My lungs burning, tree branches whipping viciously against my face and arms. The 200 feet felt like 2 miles. Finally, I saw the orange glow of the bonfire breaking through the trees. We burst out of the tree line like we were on fire, screaming for help at the top of our lungs. We didn't stop sprinting until we practically collided with a group of startled adults holding coffee cups. I spun around, gasping for air, fully expecting to see the man in the dark jacket burst out of the woods behind us. But the edge of the trees was completely empty. My parents rushed over, their faces pale with shock. I blurted out the entire story in jagged, hyperventilating sentences. The man on the hayride, the man watching the bonfire, the man with the candy deep in the woods. Ryan, sobbing beside me, nodded his head in frantic agreement. The resort erupted into chaos. My, my dad and three other fathers grabbed heavy maglights and charged into the woods. The resort staff scrambled. The local police were called. The cops arrived 30 minutes later, heavily armed and annoyed. They took our statements, patted our heads, and marched into the dark with high-powered flashlights. We huddled inside our locked cabin, every creak of the floorboards making my mother jump. The next morning, an officer knocked on our door. They had combed the entire property, sweeping every trail and checking every single registered guest. They found absolutely nothing. No one matching his description was staying at the resort. No strange vehicles were parked in the lot. The police concluded he must have been a drifter, someone who had wandered onto the property from the highway, looking for an opportunity. We packed our bags and left before noon. As we drove away, I stared out the backseat window at the impenetrable wall of the woods, absolutely certain he was standing just beyond the tree line, white, watching us leave. I never saw Ian again, but I think about that night constantly. I don't think about the chase. I don't think about the screaming. I think about the Reese's cup. I think about what would have happened if we were just a little bit younger, just a little bit more naive, if we had taken one step forward instead of running back. Because I know with terrifying certainty that if we had walked toward that man in the dark, we never would have walked out of those woods again. And for our final descent into darkness, we look at the quiet, mundane terror of being home alone. Because sometimes the most horrifying monsters aren't hiding in the woods. They are walking right up to your back door. My name is Roger, and 3 years ago, the holiday I loved more than any other became a night I will never, ever forget. I was 29 years old, working a soul-crushing, mundane corporate job. I was the lowest man on the totem pole, which meant I inherited all the garbage shifts and was constantly denied time off. So, when Halloween, which happened to fall on a Saturday that year, rolled around, and I actually had the evening entirely to myself, I was ecstatic. I lived in a small, single-story house situated on the quiet, sprawling outskirts of town. It wasn't completely isolated in the middle of nowhere, but the houses were spaced far apart, separated by thick patches of woods. My girlfriend was out of state visiting her parents, leaving me entirely alone for the weekend. I was ready for a perfect night. I bought 3 massive bags of expensive candy, ordered a large pepperoni pizza, and queued up a marathon of horror movies. For the first few hours, it was exactly as I had planned. The doorbell would chime, I'd hand out candy to tiny ghosts and superheroes, and retreat back to my couch. But my street had a strict, unspoken curfew. By 9 o'clock, the porch lights up and down the block clicked off. The families retreated indoors, and the neighborhood plunged into a deep, eerie silence. By 10:30 p.m., the trick-or-treaters had long since vanished. I was sprawled horizontally on my couch, the remaining bowl of candy resting on my chest, half watching The Conjuring 2. Then, over the low hum of the television, I heard it. Knock. Right. Knock. Knock. Wait. Late. Late. Knock. It was faint, and it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the side door, located off the kitchen, which opened onto my driveway. I groaned, assuming it was a group of obnoxious teenagers running late and trying to score leftover candy. I heaved myself off the couch, walked through the kitchen, and flipped on the exterior floodlight. I opened the side door. The driveway was completely empty. The floodlight illuminated nothing but the bare concrete and a few dead leaves skittering across the asphalt in the wind. I rolled my eyes. Ding dong ditch. A classic Halloween staple. I locked the deadbolt, killed the floodlight, and walked back to the comfort of my couch. 15 minutes later, the sound returned. But this time, It wasn't a knock, and it wasn't coming from the side door. It was coming from the sliding glass door at the very back of the house, leading out to the wooden deck. Jiggle. Light. Right. Light. Light. Click. Someone was slowly, methodically turning the metal handle of my back door. The blood in my veins turned to ice water. I muted the television instantly. The house was plunged into a suffocating silence. The rattling continued. It wasn't the frantic, chaotic pulling of a prankster. It was slow, deliberate. The sound of someone cautiously testing the lock, trying to determine if it would give way without making too much noise. I dropped to a crouch, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I practically crawled out of the living room and into the darkened kitchen, staying below the level of the countertops. I peeked around the edge of the kitchen island, looking through the vertical blinds covering the sliding glass door. Illuminated entirely by the pale, cold moonlight spilling onto the wooden deck, was a man. He was crouched low to the ground, his face pressed uncomfortably close to the glass. He was wearing head-to-toe black clothing. Pushed up high onto his forehead, resting on his hairline, was a cheap, cracked plastic Halloween mask, a grotesque, smiling clown face. But what made my stomach violently drop was what he was holding in his right hand. It was a heavy, rusted metal crowbar. He wasn't acting like a panicked burglar. He wasn't darting his eyes around. He was perfectly calm. Methodical. He moved with the terrifying assurance of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. And as I watched him press his face to the glass, a sickening realization washed over me. The glow from the muted television was reflecting in his eyes. He knew I was inside, and he did not care. I didn't scream. I didn't turn on a light. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, grabbed my cell phone off the counter, and slithered out of the kitchen into the narrow hallway. My fingers were shaking so violently, I almost dropped the phone as I dialed 911. The dispatcher answered immediately. I pressed the phone tight to my ear and cupped my hand over my mouth, whispering in a frantic, breathy rush. "There's a man trying to break into my house," I whispered. "He's at the back door. He has a crowbar." The dispatcher's voice was a lifeline of calm. She demanded my address, confirmed units were being dispatched immediately, and ordered me to lock myself in a secure room and stay on the line. I couldn't run upstairs. The wooden stairs creaked loudly, and I knew if I made a sudden noise, he would instantly know exactly where I was. Instead, I army crawled to the top of the short flight of stairs leading down to my finished basement. I huddled on the top landing in the pitch black, gripping a heavy chef's knife I had blindly grabbed from the kitchen counter block. "I'm on the basement stairs," I whispered into the phone. Through the silence of the house, I heard a sharp, metallic screech. The man had given up on the sliding glass door. He was moving. I strained my ears. I heard the crunch of his boots stepping off the wooden deck and onto the gravel path that ran alongside the foundation of the house. He was moving toward the side of the house, toward the basement windows. Scrape. Wait. Tup, tup. The sound of the aluminum window screen being violently pried off the frame echoed through the floorboards. "He's at the basement window." I breathed into the phone, tears of sheer panic finally spilling down my face. "He's trying to get into the basement." "Officers are 2 miles away, Roger," the dispatcher said, her voice tight. "Stay quiet. Do not engage." And then, the sound I had been dreading shattered the silence. Smash. The heavy, unmistakable sound of a glass window pane shattering inward. He was breaking in. The psychological terror of that moment is impossible to articulate. A standard burglar, upon hearing someone moving inside a house, will flee. They want easy targets, empty homes. But this man had looked through the glass, seen the flickering light of my television, and actively chose to shatter the window anyway. He wasn't there for my television. He was there for me. Seconds stretched into agonizing hours. I gripped the kitchen knife so hard my knuckles popped, preparing to swing blindly into the dark if a shadow appeared at the bottom of the stairs. But then, the crunching footsteps outside resumed. He was moving away from the broken window. He was circling the front of the house. Suddenly, a blinding sweep of bright, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the narrow gaps in my front window blinds. The wail of a siren abruptly died as a cruiser slammed into park in my driveway. Relief hit me so hard my knees buckled. I slumped against the wall, dropping the knife onto the carpet. Through the front window, I heard men shouting commands. I heard the heavy thud of running boots on grass. I crawled to the front door, peered through the peephole, and watched the chaos unfold on my front lawn. The man in black had bolted the moment the cruisers pulled up, but he didn't make it far. Two heavily armed officers tackled him violently into the damp grass just past my property line, pinning him down and screaming at him to stop resisting. I stood in my living room, trembling uncontrollably, until a third officer approached my front door and knocked gently, announcing himself. I opened the door, practically falling into his arms. As I stood on my front porch, answering rapid-fire questions from the responding officers, I watched them haul the man to his feet. The cracked clown mask was hanging loosely around his neck. But it wasn't the man that made my blood run cold. It was the evidence bag one of the officers was carrying. It was the heavy black duffel bag the man had slung over his shoulder when he arrived. The officer unzipped it to inspect the contents under the harsh glare of his flashlight. Inside the bag, clearly visible, were rolls of heavy-duty duct tape, a massive bundle of heavy plastic zip ties, and the rusted metal crowbar. This man wasn't a burglar. He wasn't a thief looking for a quick score to pawn. He was a predator, and he arrived equipped with a terrifyingly specific toolkit. A detective followed up with me a few weeks later to gather my official testimony for the upcoming trial. He sat across from me in an interrogation room and confirmed my worst fears. The man they arrested had an extensive, violent criminal record. He had served time for aggravated assault and breaking undentering. But more terrifyingly, the detective informed me that he was currently the prime suspect in a series of unsolved home invasions in the neighboring county. Home invasions where the occupants had simply, vanished. And then, the detective told me what else they had found in his duffel bag that night. Items the patrol officers hadn't pulled out on my front lawn. Tucked into the bottom of the bag, wrapped in a dark towel, was a fully loaded Colt .45 handgun gun. Accompanying it were several freshly sharpened hunting knives and 50 feet of thick nylon rope. To this day, I refuse to be alone in my house on Halloween night. I leave all the exterior lights blazing, lock every single deadbolt, and usually check into a brightly lit hotel in the city. Halloween is supposed to be a night of fake blood, rubber masks, and harmless scares. But whenever the wind rattles my windows in late October, I don't think about ghosts or ghouls. I think about the terrifying fragility of life. And I think about the bone-chilling reality that if that 911 dispatcher hadn't sent those cruisers exactly when she did, if they had been delayed by traffic, or stopped for coffee, if they had arrived just 5 minutes later, I would not be here to tell you this story. Welcome, listeners. Settle in, lock your doors, and take a look out your window. We surround ourselves with physical boundaries, wooden fences, property lines, deadbolts, and drywall, and we convince ourselves that these flimsy barriers are enough to keep the outside world at bay. We buy homes in quiet neighborhoods, wave at the people retrieving their mail, and assume that because the lawns are manicured, the minds behind the curtains must be, too. But how well do you really know the people living right next door? What secrets are they keeping just a few feet away from where you sleep? Tonight, we have 3 accounts that explore the terrifying reality of what happens when the illusion of the safe, friendly neighbor shatters. The house on the left. Let's step into the shoes of a man named Mike. Just last year, Mike and his fiancée achieved a milestone that feels increasingly out of reach for many. They purchased their very first starter home. It was a modest, 2-story structure nestled in an unremarkable, sleepy suburb in Georgia. To anyone else, it was just drywall and shingles, but to them, it was a sanctuary. It was the beginning of their lives together. The street was the picture of suburban mundanity. Identical driveways, chain-link fences, and neighbors who offered polite, passing waves. The older couple to their right was incredibly warm. The man across the street made a point to jog over and introduce himself. But the property to their left was an entirely different story. For the first few days, the house on the left seemed entirely abandoned, save for the solitary car parked stubbornly in the driveway. Heavy, opaque curtains smothered every single window. The exterior was well kept, not a blade of grass out of place, yet it radiated a heavy, hollow energy. It was the kind of dark that makes you feel cold even in the suffocating Georgia heat. The first sign of life was subtle. Mike and his fiancée were hauling groceries from the trunk of their car when she suddenly stopped, nudging him and whispering under her breath. Mike followed her gaze to the neighbor's front window. There, half concealed by the heavy fabric of the curtain, stood a man. He wasn't simply looking out at the street. His gaze was locked directly onto them. Mike offered a tentative, neighborly nod, but the man didn't reciprocate. The second he realized he had been spotted, he simply retreated into the gloom of his living room. Over the next week, this silent surveillance escalated. Mike would catch glimpses of the man lingering in his downstairs windows when leaving for work. His fiancée reported seeing him staring down from his second-story window while she checked the mailbox. It was never a casual glance. It was heavy, deliberate, and entirely unnatural. The tension snapped one night around midnight. Mike was upstairs, winding down for the evening, pacing past his own bedroom window. Out of pure habit, he glanced toward the neighboring house. The man was standing right there in his own upstairs window, which directly faced Mike's bedroom. But this time, he wasn't hiding behind a curtain. He was fully exposed, standing rigidly straight, his face illuminated by the ambient streetlight, staring directly into their private space. Mike's blood ran cold. The sheer audacity of it left him paralyzed for a fraction of a second. But as soon as the neighbor realized Mike was staring back, he abruptly stepped away, melting into the shadows. The very next morning, a knock echoed through Mike's front door. Standing on the porch was the neighbor. He introduced himself as Gordon. His demeanor was a jarring contrast to the lurking figure from the night before. Gordon wore a wide, seemingly genuine smile and immediately launched into a rehearsed apology. He claimed he had simply been adjusting something on his window ledge the night before and hadn't meant to intrude on their privacy. It was a plausible enough excuse, delivered with a disarming grin. Mike didn't entirely buy it. There was an undeniable, erratic energy simmering just beneath Gordon's friendly facade, but he accepted the apology to keep the peace. A week passed. The uneasy truce held, right up until the middle of the night, when Mike's fiancée violently shook him awake. Her voice was a trembling whisper. She had heard footsteps in the backyard. Mike threw off the covers and crept toward the window. The moonlight cast long shadows across their empty lawn, but one of those shadows was moving. It was a full-grown man, pacing methodically back and forth across their grass, searching the ground as if looking for something buried. Operating on a spike of pure adrenaline, Mike shouted through the glass. The intruder instantly froze, then practically sprinted toward the wooden gate, slamming it violently behind him as he escaped. A few nights later, the nightmare repeated itself. A faint rustling jolted them awake. This time, the sound was distinct, metallic, and terrifying, the unmistakable sound of someone shimmying the lock. Mike. Mike rushed to the glass. The intruder was back. Mike. This time, Mike didn't just shout a warning. He screamed that he was calling the police. The figure abandoned the lock, pivoting toward the gate. But as he turned, the moonlight caught his face and posture perfectly. It was Gordon. Mike bellowed his neighbor's name into the night air. Gordon didn't flinch, didn't look back, and didn't speed up. He just calmly walked out and slammed the gate. Furious and terrified, Mike marched straight out his front door and pounded on Gordon's house. Gordon answered almost instantly, fully dressed, completely awake. And he was laughing. Gordon spun a frantic, chaotic lie, claiming he was simply chasing away local teenagers who routinely hopped the neighborhood fences. He smiled the entire time he spoke, but the smile never reached his eyes. Beneath a jovial, neighborly mask, Mike saw something primal and vicious. He saw pure, unadulterated hatred. The climax of this psychological warfare arrived the very next day, when Gordon practically insisted the couple come over for a Chinese food dinner on Friday night. Desperate to defuse the escalating situation, they agreed. The moment they stepped into Gordon's home, at 7. Like 0 p.m., the air felt toxic. Gordon was already heavily intoxicated, slurring his words as he relentlessly poured himself glass after glass of cheap wine. The passive-aggressive jabs started immediately. He made bizarre, pointed comments about their race, masking them poorly as awkward jokes. When the food arrived, he snapped at them for offering to help set the table. As the wine bottles emptied, Gordon's filter dissolved entirely. The passive aggression morphed into explosive anger. He began pacing the room, his face flushed red, ranting about the history of their town. He made it violently clear that he despised the fact that an Asian couple had moved onto his street. He casually, proudly confessed to trespassing in their yard. He stood over them, screaming that they were not welcome, that they did not belong. Mike and his fiancée didn't engage. They stood up in total silence, walked out the front door, and locked themselves inside their own home. Desperate for context, they began knocking on other neighbors' doors. The picture that emerged was grim. Gordon was a bitter, alcoholic recluse whose wife had abandoned him years prior, but knowing his tragic backstory didn't make living next to a hostile, volatile racist any less terrifying. They spent the next few weeks living like hostages in their own home, keeping the blinds drawn, avoiding the yard, holding their breath every time a floorboard creaked. And then, the glass shattered. It happened in the dead of night. A deafening crash from the ground floor sent them both leaping from their bed. When Mike reached the living room, surrounded by glittering shards of broken glass, he found a solid, heavy brick resting on his floor. Mike, no message, just a violent promise. They called the police. The officers knocked on Gordon's door, but he played the role of the confused, innocent neighbor perfectly. Without video footage or a confession, the police hands were tied. It was just a documented incident, a piece of paper in a file. The mental toll became unbearable. They discussed installing cameras, reinforcing the doors, staying to fight for the home they had worked so hard to buy. But the reality was simple. They were exhausted, and they were terrified. But they knew with a dark certainty that a break was just the beginning. Like, less than 2 months after unpacking their lives, they packed them right back into cardboard boxes. They abandoned their dream home, fleeing the neighborhood entirely. To this day, Mike firmly believes that if they had stayed to fight, the next visit from the police would have been to investigate a double homicide. The secret in the basement. Our next story takes us back to late 2021. A man named Noah and his fiancée, Gabby, had just secured a beautiful two-story home, the perfect canvas for the family they planned to build. The neighborhood was picturesque. and the crowning jewel of this idyllic setting seemed to be the couple living directly to their right. Daniel and Veronica were in their late 30s, radiating the kind of effortless suburban charm that makes you instantly drop your guard. They even showed up on Noah's doorstep during the first week with a freshly baked red velvet cake. They were kind, conversational, and seemingly perfect. But perfection is often just a very thin coat of paint. The cracks began to show a couple of weeks after Noah and Gabby settled in. It was past 11:00 p.m. when Noah was pulled from his sleep by the sharp, undeniable sound of shouting. He moved to his bedroom window, peering out into the dark. The angle of the houses obscured his line of sight, but the violent verbal altercation was unmistakably radiating from Daniel and Veronica's property. A few moments later, the front door ripped open. Veronica stormed down the driveway, threw herself into her car, and sped off into the night. Noah mentioned it to Gabby the next morning. They rationalized it the way we all do when we don't want to peer too closely at other people's pain. Every couple fights. Sometimes you just need to drive around the block to cool off. But the screaming didn't stop. Later that same week, Noah and Gabby stepped out of their car, only to be greeted by the muffled sounds of another vicious argument echoing through Daniel's closed storm door. And then, the silence came. A few days passed, and Veronica's car remained absent from the driveway. Daniel's vehicle was parked in its usual spot, and Noah would occasionally spot him grabbing the mail or taking out the trash. A week bled into 2 weeks, and there was still no sign of Veronica. Gabby speculated that the constant fighting had finally culminated in a divorce. It made sense logically. But the suddenness of her departure, combined with Daniel's bizarre new behavior, gnawed at Noah's instincts. Daniel was actively dodging them. He no longer offered the cheerful waves across the lawn. When Noah did manage to catch him outside, Daniel's eyes darted frantically. He spoke in rapid, clipped sentences, visibly vibrating with an anxious energy, desperate to flee back behind his locked doors. After 3 weeks of this agonizing limbo, Noah couldn't take it anymore. Ignoring Gabby's warnings to mind his own business, he marched across the manicured grass and rang Daniel's doorbell. He waited. 1 minute passed. Almost 3 full minutes ticked by before the deadbolt finally clicked. When the door swung open, the man standing before Noah looked like a quartered animal. Daniel was drenched in sweat, his hair plastered to his forehead. His chest was heaving, and plastered across his face was the most grotesque, forced smile Noah had ever seen. Noah kept his voice steady, asking casually about Veronica, mentioning he hadn't seen her or her car in nearly a month. Daniel stammered. His eyes darted past Noah toward the street. He claimed that Veronica's mother had fallen severely ill out of state, and she had driven down to become her primary caretaker. It was a clumsy, hollow lie. Noah knew it instantly. He pressed slightly harder, asking Daniel why he looked like he had just run a marathon in his living room. Daniel laughed nervously, speaking at a frantic, unnatural pace, claiming he was in the middle of an intense, upstairs workout routine. Noah was just about to accept the lie and retreat when a sound shattered the suburban quiet. It was faint, muffled by layers of drywall and floorboards, but it was unmistakable. A woman's voice, screaming for help. Noah froze, his eyes locking onto Daniel's. "What?" he demanded. Daniel didn't miss a beat, though the panic in his eyes was blinding. "Oh," he said quickly, his voice cracking. "I'm playing a movie upstairs. I must have forgot to pause it." The logic instantly unraveled. How could he be working out to a screaming movie? "No, I didn't argue." He forced a polite nod, said he'd catch up later, and calmly walked back to his house. The second his front door closed, the calm vanished. He relayed the horror to Gabby, and immediately dialed 911. He requested a welfare check, begging to remain anonymous, though he knew Daniel would trace the police right back to him. 10 minutes later, the illusion of the quiet neighborhood was completely obliterated. Red and blue lights flooded the street. 5 cruisers and an ambulance swarmed Daniel's property. Noah and Gabby stood on their lawn, watching in absolute shock as officers stormed the house. Minutes later, Daniel emerged in handcuffs, flanked by heavily armed police. But then came the stretcher. The truth that unraveled over the next few days was sickening. Behind the red velvet cake and the warm smiles, Daniel was a monster. The relationship had been deeply abusive, but he hadn't just hit her. He had constructed a prison. For those 3 long weeks when everyone assumed Veronica had moved on, she was locked in a subterranean basement Noah didn't even know existed. Daniel had sold her, or to maintain the illusion of her departure. He had kept her captive, subjecting her to unimaginable horrors right beneath their feet. And that scream Noah heard on the porch. It wasn't a movie. While Daniel was taking those agonizing 3 minutes to answer the front door, he had warned Veronica to stay absolutely silent. When she heard Noah's voice, she took a desperate, fatal gamble and screamed for her life. Daniel had gone downstairs and stabbed her 5 times. That's why he was sweating. That's why his heart was racing. Noah had been casually conversing with a man who had a bloody knife freshly tucked away. Tragically, Veronica succumbed to her wounds hours later in the hospital. As the police were shoving Daniel into the back of a cruiser, he locked eyes with Noah across the lawn. His voice was completely devoid of emotion as he delivered a chilling promise. "I know it was you who snitched out on me. And you'll regret this." Daniel was locked away, but the terror he inflicted didn't stay behind bars. A few nights after the arrest, Noah woke in the pitch black of his bedroom. Standing at the foot of his bed, silhouetted against the dark, was Daniel. He was holding a knife. He leaned forward, whispering those exact same words. "I told you you would regret this." Noah screamed, scrambling backward against the headboard, only to violently jolt awake. It was a nightmare. His wife pulled him close, asking what was wrong. Noah lied. He said it was just a bad dream, unable to vocalize the paralyzing fear that had taken root in his mind. They eventually married and fled to a different part of the city, but the trauma of sharing a property line with a butcher remains a permanent scar. You never truly know the monsters smiling at you from across the fence. Like the voice in the wall. For our final story, we travel to the dense, claustrophobic expanse of Queens, New York. When you rent an apartment in the city, you enter into a silent, unwritten contract. You agree to ignore the muffled arguments, the heavy footsteps overhead, and the faint scent of someone else's dinner. You share walls, you share air, but you pretend you live entirely alone. 2 years ago, a 24-year-old woman named Devin moved into an old, narrow duplex. The building was sliced cleanly down the middle. Devin occupied the left half. A man she had never met, and never even seen, rented the right. According to the landlord, the neighbor worked graveyard shifts and kept strictly to himself. That was perfectly fine with Devin. Her bedroom was located on the 2nd floor. The wall that her bed rested against was the exact same wall that bordered the neighbor's bedroom. It was incredibly thin. So thin that if Devin pressed her palm against the drywall, she could feel the faint vibrations of movement on the other side. The first week was unremarkable. Devin worked exhausting hours, came home, ate, and collapsed into bed. She was thrilled to finally have a space to call her own. But then, the noises began. She was lying in the dark, aimlessly scrolling through her phone, when a voice bled through the drywall. It was undeniably male, but it was deeply distorted. It was unnaturally high-pitched, like a grown man forcing his vocal cords into a bizarre, cartoonish falsetto. It was a rapid, frantic mumbling. Because the wall was practically paper, it sounded as though this bizarre, muttering stranger was standing right at the foot of her bed. She couldn't decipher a single word. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was practicing lines. Maybe he was on a strange phone call. Eventually, The manic whispering faded, and exhaustion dragged her to sleep. A few nights later, the voice returned. It was much louder this time, and the high-pitched falsetto was gone. It was a deep, gravelly tone. Devin pressed her ear to the cold plaster. He wasn't speaking to anyone else. He was having a full, intense conversation with himself. It was unsettling, the kind of weirdness you try to laugh off, but that leaves a knot of anxiety in your stomach. She pulled the blankets over her head, desperately trying to drown out the madness next door. 2 weeks later, the auditory hallucinations escalated into physical contact. Devin was drifting off to sleep when a sound shot through her skull. Tap, 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 tap. 2 sharp, distinct knocks on the drywall, originating directly adjacent to where her head rested on her pillow. It was so loud, so close, that Devin physically flinched, her body jerking away from the wall. She sat up in the dark, her breath catching in her throat. The silence stretched out. Then, exactly from the same spot. Tap, 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 tap. This was no settling pipe. This was no shifting foundation. This was human intention. She scrambled to the opposite edge of the mattress, shivering in the dark. She wanted to hammer her fist against the plaster and demand he stop, but a primal instinct warned her that acknowledging him would only invite something worse. The knocking became a nightly ritual. Sometimes they were soft, fluttering taps. Other times they were aggressive, heavy thuds that vibrated to the floorboards. It always happened late at night. It always happened right when she was slipping into unconsciousness. She started sleeping with headphones blasting white noise, agonizing over the terrifying reality of the architecture. There was a strange, erratic man lying quite literally 2 feet away from her head, separated only by an inch of cheap wooden dust. The knocks were nothing compared to the night the boundary was finally broken night. Devin was lying on her side, facing the dark wall. Her eyes were closed. The room was bathed in the sickly orange glow of a street lamp filtering through the blinds. Light, then it came. 3 slow, methodical knocks. Like thud. Like thud. Devin squeezed her eyes shut, pretending to be asleep. Then, slicing through the plaster, came that grotesque, high-pitched, cartoonish voice. It was muffled, but the articulation was agonizingly clear. "What are you doing in there?" Her lungs completely seized. Her heart hammered against her ribs with such violence, she felt it in her teeth. He wasn't just making noise anymore. He was talking to her. He was waiting for her to answer. She lunged across the bed, grabbed her phone, and dialed her boyfriend, whispering frantically into the receiver. He rushed over immediately, staying awake with her in the brightly lit room until dawn. The neighbor remained dead silent for the rest of the night, which somehow made it infinitely worse. It implied that he was listening. He knew she wasn't alone anymore. A few days of tense, agonizing silence followed. Devin tried to convince herself she had suffered a stress-induced auditory hallucination. And then came the night she fled. She was in a state of deep, heavy sleep. Suddenly, something violently snapped her awake. Her eyes flew open. The room was pitch black. Right beside her head, the wall erupted into a frantic, rhythmic drumming. Fingers hammering violently against the drywall in a chaotic crescendo. The dam broke. The fear mutated into a blinding, hysterical rage. Devin sat up and screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice staring through the duplex. "Leave me alone." She sat there, chest heaving, adrenaline flooding her veins, waiting for his muffled laughter or another knock. What she got instead defies all logic and sanity. A voice answered her, but it didn't come through the wall. It came from the dark corner of her own bedroom. It was a deep, gravelly, commanding baritone, and it was less than 5 feet away. Go to sleep. Devin didn't even process the movement. 1 second she was on the bed, and the next she was hurtling down the narrow staircase, her bare feet slamming against the hardwood. She threw open her front door and sprinted out into the freezing New York night, screaming hysterically into the empty street. She didn't look back. She knew if she turned her head, she would see him standing in the doorway. She kept screaming until a neighbor from 2 houses down stepped onto his porch. He took one look at her pale, terrified face and immediately dialed 911. The police arrived in minutes. Devin babbled out the entire horrifying sequence. 2 officers unholstered their weapons and cleared her duplex. When they emerged, their expressions were grim. The house was completely empty. They checked the closets, beneath the bed, the bathroom. Nothing. They noted that her front door was wide open, with absolutely no signs of first entry. They asked if she had unlocked the deadbolt when she fled. Her mind was a complete blur of panic. She couldn't remember touching the lock. The officers hammered on the adjoining door of the neighbor's unit. No answer. The car was in the driveway. Packages were piled on the stoop, but the house felt like a tomb. Devin never slept in that room again. Her boyfriend escorted her back over the next few days to pack her belongings into trash bags. They pounded on the neighbor's door repeatedly, desperate for an explanation, but he never materialized. She broke her lease, threatening her landlord with legal action until he relented. Months later, the landlord casually mentioned that the mysterious tenant next door had eventually vanished in the middle of the night, leaving no forwarding address. To this day, Devin is haunted by the logistics of that night. Did the police miss a hidden crawl space? Did she leave her front door unlocked, allowing him to slip inside while she slept? Or was the psychological torment so severe that her mind projected his voice into the shadows of her room? Whatever the truth is, the outcome remains the same. The boundary between her sanctuary and the terror next door didn't exist at all. Thank you for listening. Remember, the next time you hear a creak in the floorboards or a faint knock on the drywall, sometimes it's just the house settling. And sometimes it's not. Stay safe out there.